I want to go to senior White House correspondent Selena Wang to start us off here. Selena, how significant is this moment for President Biden giving his final speech to world leaders at the UN when just a few months ago he was running for a second term?
This is a really bittersweet moment for President Biden. And I think that quote you mentioned just then, that was a really powerful moment. And it was a rare, candid point in that speech when he talked about stepping down from this race and passing on the torch, that he loves his country more than keeping power. And he really took that to the more than 100 global leaders who were there in the audience, saying that you should also remember that this is about the people. This is not about holding on to power. And in terms of why this is bittersweet, it's not just that it's capping off his more than 50 years in public service. He also knows that there's a lot he still wanted to accomplish. He had a lot of goals, and the possibility of reaching those goals are now dimming, including the war in Ukraine still raging, as well as trying to reach that ceasefire deal in Gaza. He made a very forceful statement there saying that the war needs to end. They need to agree to a ceasefire deal. But the reality is that U.S. efforts to negotiate that ceasefire deal so far have not come to fruition. And President Biden there in the speech, he also notably touched on and he acknowledged the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. That was largely seen as a disastrous withdrawal. But President Biden, he was suggesting that history will look positively on his decision, on his determination to end that long war in Afghanistan, talking about that disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. But overall, Diane, this was really a quintessential President Biden speech. He acknowledged all of the tragedy and wars raging, but he ended on a message of hope that he believes there's still a way forward through alliances and through working together.
Yeah, big message from hope and unity today throughout that speech from the president. I want to bring in ABC's Patrick Reevell, who covers Russia and Ukraine for us also, because this was a big focus of this speech. Patrick, no surprise. You hear the president here saying that Russia's war has failed, that they set out to destroy Ukraine. Ukraine still stands. They set out to weaken NATO. NATO now has 2 more members than it did before this war started. So what's at stake here for President Biden's message when it comes to calling on these leaders not to back down now, not to lose that faith and that strength, and to stick it through to support Ukraine to the end?
Yeah, Diane, I think we saw that Ukraine was top of Biden's agenda here at the UN. You know, he made this impassioned plea for the world to keep supporting Ukraine and not to falter now, saying we can't grow weary, we can't look away. And I think it was striking that his rhetoric did resemble what we've seen from President Volodymyr Zelensky, who is here this week, who is making a very similar plea, saying that he has a victory plan, and that victory plan is simply to strengthen Ukraine, to eventually force Russia to negotiate for a just peace. And what we heard from President Biden was that the world should stand with Ukraine to push for a just and durable peace. And it's notable, I think, that there was applause in the hall of the UN there when he made this call, and when he called for countries to basically defend the UN Charter, because, of course, the UN was founded to prevent wars. But I think the other thing, though, of course, is that when he's calling for this commitment, perhaps the biggest questions right now are around the US's own commitment, because not only are we seeing that the Ukrainians are pushing the US and the Biden administration to provide weapons, for example, and that the Biden administration so far has been unwilling to do it, but there are a lot of criticisms coming from in Ukraine, but also within the US, that the Biden administration doesn't seem to have a plan to keep Ukraine more than just in the fight, but to actually try and win and try and put pressure properly on Russia, because we're seeing Russia right now advancing again in eastern Ukraine. And then, of course, looming over all of this is a possible second Trump presidency. President Trump has said just in the past couple of weeks that he declined to say whether he wants Ukraine to win. J.D. Vance, his running mate, has said that he believes Ukraine should give up territory to Russia and that they should abandon NATO membership, which is something that President Zelensky is asking for here. And, President Zelensky has said he's going to meet with President Biden, with Vice President Harris. He said he also hopes to meet with President Trump. But I think, this question that is looming over all of this is this uncertainty of what will come when the U.S. election happens. And, of course, that is going to determine so much of these conflicts around the world, Diane.
And, of course, the other thing looming over the Biden presidency is the war in Gaza and now the conflict in Lebanon. I want to bring in foreign correspondent Tom Soufi-Burridge, who's in Tel Aviv, looking at that part of this. Tom, President Biden says his administration is working tirelessly toward a solution. They want residents of Israel and Lebanon and Gaza to all be able to return to their homes safely. But this is similar language to what we've heard since the October 7th attack. So what's the latest on the conflict, particularly the escalation over the northern border with Hezbollah in Lebanon. And where does this go from here?
Yeah, just firstly on the speech, Diane, in terms of the Middle East, I think this for President Biden was, in terms of the Middle East, was more a speech about aspirations, not achievements. That was almost inevitable. The aspiration to end the war in Gaza, saying now is the time for the sides to finalise the deal. We had applause for that point. Inevitably, there's a consensus within the UN that the war needs to end, but ultimately that's proved elusive, and there's no sign that that's going to change any time before President Biden leaves office. And also, of course, the aspiration that the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah in the north and in southern Lebanon does not turn into a much wider regional conflict. Look, in a way, it has already been moving in that direction within the last 24, 48 hours. The latest, as you asked me, is that we're seeing, close to 600 people killed, according to Lebanese officials, within the last 2 days. That is the deadliest day in Lebanon in decades. And, we're seeing Israel changing its rules in terms of going after Hezbollah sites, what it says are missile launch sites, weapons storage sites in southern Lebanon, in the northeast, in built-up civilian areas. Israel wasn't really doing that so much. It now is doing that quite blatantly and deliberately, saying that it has to take out Hezbollah's ability to strike Israel in order to return citizens to the north. Look, as you said, President Biden couldn't tell us much new, really, in terms of the Middle East. If you look over the course of the last year, the Middle East has become a much more unpredictable and dangerous place. That isn't obviously entirely down to US policy. In some senses, the US back in April, that amazing coalition that the US brought together when Iran fired that massive barrage of rockets and missiles at Israel, the US led that coalition and really helped to dial down the possibility of a major war in this region between the two prime military powers, Iran and Israel. So, President Biden didn't mention that. I thought that was interesting. In a way, that's probably the US's biggest achievement over the last few months. There was a ceasefire in Gaza early in the war. More than 100 hostages were released back then. That's a distant memory right now. And really, the US has pressured Israel. It has tried to, via other mediators, pressure Hamas. But really, there hasn't been much tangible achievement in terms of the war in Gaza, in terms of US and other international diplomacy to try and dial that down. And ultimately, that's why I think President Biden could only really repeat the aspirations of his administration going into this kind of final stage of his presidency, rather than list, more impressive achievements.
And foreign correspondent Marcus Moore is in Beirut. So, Marcus, I want to take this point to you because one of those aspirations was President Biden saying that a diplomatic solution is possible between Israel and these forces in Lebanon, Hezbollah, that they have been in conflict for a while. How realistic does that seem at this point?
Well, Diane, as the president was saying that a diplomatic solution is the only solution, we were hearing the sounds of explosions happening here along the coast. Certainly, in our conversations with U.S. officials at the embassy here, we've also spoken with officials with the French embassy here in Beirut. Everyone has talked about the need for a diplomatic solution, that the sides have to keep talking to avert a wider war, which is something so many have been concerned about. But I think it's critically important to point out or to home in on the point that, at least here in Lebanon, and as it relates to Hezbollah, that there has to be a ceasefire in Gaza. They don't see the conflict here in southern Lebanon and northern Israel as being separate from the fighting that we've seen in Gaza. And so as long as that fighting continues, that we'll continue to see the fight here. As you know, Hezbollah has vowed to continue hitting targets in northern Israel as long as the bombardment continues in Gaza. And so, Diane, it's notable today has been very active. Perhaps not as intense as yesterday, but still quite busy and deadly as well. We've heard from the Ministry of Health that as many as 6 people were killed in a recent strike in southern Beirut just today. 15 people were injured, and these strikes continue not only here in Beirut, but as you know, farther south in southern Lebanon, in the areas of Tyre and along the border. And in the midst of that, People have still been trying to evacuate the homes and villages in those areas and have gone to shelters or have gone to relatives' homes. But we are still hearing the stories, Diane, of airstrikes happening as those people were trying to evacuate, and also, sadly, the loss of their loved ones in the midst of these operations.
And I want to bring in State Department reporter Shannon Kingston, because, Shannon, I also found it interesting the president naming Iran by name, saying specifically, talking about their role here and the critical nature of keeping a nuclear weapon away from Iran. What did you make of that part of the speech and this sort of overall theme?
Absolutely. It's something the president probably could have emphasized more, because it is a success that they've had. The fact that Iran hasn't fully entered the fray here in the conflict in the Middle East. Now, of course, Iran is still making progress towards the development of a nuclear weapon. The administration has warned that they could have enough fissile material to do that in just weeks. Indirect talks between the U.S. and Iran have been broken down for some time, so it is a problem looming on the horizon. But overall, we saw President Biden, he did really bring the room back to the horrors of Hamas's attack on October 7th. He tried to remind the world why we're seeing this conflict between Israel and Hamas and Israel and Hezbollah. But what we didn't hear was that full-throated vow that the U.S. would uphold Israel's defense at any cost. That's something that has become almost boilerplate language for these kinds of addresses, and something he has said in previous speeches to the UN. Now, he did still give plenty of points that Israel would like in that speech, but most of this work towards de-escalation is going to happen away from the spotlight in private meetings.
And ABC News national security defense analyst Mick Mulroy, of course, a lot of the more concrete parts of plans like this do come out in those private meetings, to Shannon's point. But standing before the world stage, this is the last time he'll address the UN General Assembly. Do you think the president did enough here to lay out concrete plans and call out concrete, requests and demands, for that matter, as opposed to aspirations?
Diane, what really struck me is he really laid out the case for why the United States is that indispensable nation, the leader of the free world, supporting Ukraine against the invasion of Russia at a time when they're about to present their plan for victory this week at the UN. That was very important to retain and remain that steadfast supporter of Ukraine. And he also talked about what the United States is doing to prevent an all-out, full-scale conflict in the Middle East. Very difficult. Both sides seem to be dug in, but the United States is the one country in the world that could essentially affect a diplomatic solution, which is the best solution in this issue. One place where he might get challenged is how history will view the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. The Taliban has essentially reneged on every part of its agreement, including on human rights, where women and girls are now almost erased from society. But I would also point out that he highlighted the war in Sudan, which does not get a lot of attention. There's around 25 million people, so half of the population there, that is on the verge of starvation. And it's important for the United States to do that, because we talk about it, the world talks about it. So I do think he did lay out this overall vision for where the United States should be in leading the free world. It's not going to go into details. That's not what speeches are like this. That does happen behind the scenes when countries to countries and staffs to staff start talking about how they can actually do the things that the president lays out as his strategic vision.
So, Selena, his final address to the UN General Assembly, what do you think this speech does for President Biden's legacy?
Well, I think it cements him as someone who was rebuilding America's global alliances, someone who took America's leadership back to the global stage after those turbulent years of the Trump administration. But I think there are going to be three key issues that are going to overshadow a lot of his achievements: the chaotic Afghanistan withdrawal, which Mick Mulroy just mentioned, the Ukraine war still raging, as well as what's happened in the Middle East. He has clearly made the case for why American leadership is absolutely critical, why alliances are critical. Yet there are also limits to that global leadership. But again, President Biden has always been an incredibly optimistic person. Even in the darkest of times, he has always portrayed a message of hope, that there's a way forward. And that's something that we heard again today. He said, despite hunger, disease, wars, questions about artificial intelligence, reflecting on his long career, his long life. He has seen America and the world recover time and time again from those dark moments.
All right, Selena, Patrick, Tom, Marcus, Shannon, and Mick, thank you all.